What's going on, everybody? We're back. We're back. As I had mentioned, numerous times to friends, and I think in the last episode, I'm going to start doing these podcasts just a little bit more sporadically, with the time and that it takes to script these for topics that I like talking about, as well as kind of everything that's going on in my life right now between finishing classwork for my PhD, starting to finish collecting data for a project that I'm continuously working on at this point, coaching, as well as planning a wedding now. This kind of project and these podcasts are going to take the back burner for a while. That's totally fine to me. I love doing these, but it's not going to be something that I'm going to be super worried about unless I have a topic that I really want to discuss with everybody or a guest that I really want to talk to. And so, moving forward, as you guys have probably noticed, these will not be coming out on a consistent basis. If I have somebody that I want to talk to, or if I think of something that I want to discuss, then, obviously I'll do that. But there's no plan set of like, once a week, once a month, twice a month, nothing like that. Just kind of going as it goes. When it comes to everything else, I mean, you might see something here. If you're watching the video, you'll see that I got a little 110% on the table. Shout out to Kevin Papa. I've been in talks with Kevin and known about 110%. I think first out of maybe everybody else. Don't want to sound like a gatekeeper or quote unquote that guy. But I was in one of the first group chats that Kevin made when he started to, market 110% and get ideas for 110%. And for him to, bring me back on the team and give me a code and all that stuff and allow me to promote the product, through my social media as well as through the podcast, it means the world to me. If you know Kevin in the powerlifting space, he is just the absolute best. He pours his heart and soul into that company. And it's truly an athlete and client first focused business. And I can't think of supporting anything else that isn't that. So, if you've ever wanted to try 110%, whether it be the pre-workout here that I've got on the table, or possibly Catalyst, which is a carbohydrate complex, or their sleep supplement, which I personally love. Someone that, obviously doesn't have the best relationship with sleep because of how busy his schedule is the sleep supplements actually really helping me out. Or creatine or really anything else, go ahead. Hit the link in the bio. I'll always have that link. If you guys want to check that stuff out, and you'll be able to use my code Rob, for a discounted price on that, on the supplements as well. And then the last thing, if you follow me on social media, which if you're listening to this, you probably do, you might have seen that I opened up some spots for coaching. Those will be continued to be open until probably around August or September. I'm going to try and take on about 1 to 2 people per month, up until that point. And then of course, when my semester starts, I will put a cap on my roster until, around December or January. Just because obviously with how busy I get during the semester, it's not fair for me to overload myself and then possibly have some poor communication with my clients or poor product. And so if you have ever wanted to work with me or wanted to know anything about, what I do through Escalate, feel free to click the link to my coaching application. That'll be linked below in the show notes as well. Fill that out. It's about 10 to 15 minutes that it takes to fill out, which may seem like a long time, but it's just basically for me to get to know you a little bit better before we hop on an inquiry call. But without further ado, I think it's time for us to hop in the podcast itself. I'll take a quick sip of water before we start, because this is a topic that I've always had my brain rattled around, in my field. It's a motor learning topic. It's a motor performance topic. And it's a topic that I've always had my brain rattled around since I started, my program, as a PhD student. And that topic is knowledge of performance, or knowledge of feedback. And essentially there's a couple things that you need to know before we kind of dive into what knowledge of performance or knowledge of results is and these feedback processes. And basically how I'm going to be outlining this podcast is I'm going to go through kind of these introductory ideas. And then I'm going to go through, what knowledge of performance and knowledge of results actually is. And then I'll kind of start to relate this both to some research that, is published, and I'll mention that, as well as to, powerlifting and strength coaching. And I think that, if you are a coach, you can get a lot out of this podcast just simply from kind of optimizing what your feedback looks like for your clients. And obviously that's going to be different for everybody, but, I personally, can kind of tell you why it's going to be different for everybody, and give you some possible, some possible advice on how to make the most out of giving your clients feedback. And for athletes, I can help you guys make the most out of getting feedback, because obviously, the first step to getting feedback is actually sending your training to your coaches and all that stuff. But so before we dive into the deep stuff about knowledge, performance, and knowledge of results, we have to make some definitions here. We have to define some things. And the first one is just the outright definition of motor learning. This is one that every single time one of my faculty members asks me, what is motor learning, I freeze. It's such a huge question. But obviously in the past I would freeze. Now I'm a little bit more comfortable with it. Basically, motor learning is just this process of acquiring a motor skill by doing it faster or doing it more accurately, or a combination of the two. And the best way that I can describe this is through learning how to type, or learning how to type your specific password for a website. And so if you are someone that has a job or is in school, and you need to constantly put in your password, that kind of your freshman year, or your first couple weeks at the job, when you were typing in that password, it was a little slow. And now you can just run through that password like it's the fastest thing that you've ever typed. And this is essentially motor learning in and of itself right there. It's actually a type of motor learning called sequence learning, where you're typing specific sequences of letters to create a full item out of it. But essentially what you're doing is you are kind of ingraining a movement pattern to where you don't even need to look at the keyboard anymore. You can do it unconsciously and just boom, write out your password. And you may have noticed that, in going from one query on a page to putting in your password, it just speeds up rapidly. And so motor learning is the process of acquiring a motor skill by means of faster and more accurate performance. And we need to understand how feedback plays a role in motor learning. And so feedback is an incredibly important tool. Obviously, it allows us to understand the difference between our movement that we do and the goal movement. And this often comes in the form of comparing some sort of feed-forward sensory prediction to the goal of the movement. And I know that might seem like a lot of jibber-jabber to a lot of people, and a lot of weird language. But essentially, feed-forward just means that you are thinking of something in the future. And then sensory prediction is your body's way of thinking of how you need to do the movement. So the best example that I can give of this is if you are walking down the path, maybe you're on a hike in the mountains, right? And you're walking down the path and you see that there's a log in front of you that you need to step over. At some point while you're walking to that log, you are going to take a couple steps, and your body, unconsciously or consciously, is going to make a feed-forward prediction. It is going to predict something about the future. And what it's going to predict is how high you need to raise your leg to then step over said log, right? And so you're going to think to yourself, either consciously or subconsciously, I need to raise my leg this high to step over that log. And then, you will either do it or not do it, and use feedback, both with success or failure, to kind of update your system on doing it again in the future. So a common way to think about that is a motor program. We can go through the majority of different ways to think about these things, whether it be a motor program, a schema, which goes into Adams' closed loop theory and a bunch of different stuff from Schmidt, which is a bunch of bare neuroscience learning, more of like animal model stuff. We can go into internal models. We can go into, what an internal model is. But in this sense, we're just going to keep it simple. I like to make the phrase, and I've said this before, that, if I were to go through all that stuff, you'd feel like you got a headache in the eye of a hurricane and your house is on fire. And so, like, none of this would make sense, and it would just be meaningless. So we're going to think of this through something called the motor program. So when we do an action and when we're learning an action, we have this sensory prediction, like I talked about earlier, that's created through the initial conditions that we're in at the start of the movement. So we have this sensory prediction. We see something in our environment and we make a prediction about it. And so we compare this initial sensory prediction to our actual response outcome. And we see how far off we are, whether or not you are, putting or lifting that leg over the actual log that you see on the trail, or whether you trip on it. And the difference between these two is going to be the sensory consequence. It's going to be the consequence of the movement. And by seeing a sensory consequence, we can then adjust our motor program and try again. So say, again, with that example of you walking down the path on a hike, and you get to a log, and say that your sensory prediction is wrong and you fall flat on your face and you're super embarrassed. You're in front of your crush and you're just like, oh man, like, I don't really like this. And you walk back around and you're like, all right, no, I got this now. I got this. And, you start walking forward. You are going to have that sensory consequence, that feedback from the difference between your initial sensory prediction and the actual result of the movement, to then update your motor program and hopefully step over that log again in a good way and actually, have a successful movement, quote unquote. And in the lab, we do this in a multitude of different ways. We look at this in a multitude of different ways. One of the most common is obviously through our reaching movements, where we simply either strap somebody into a robotic exoskeleton, or we have them grip some sort of like robotic manipulandum, which is just like an arm that can, reach out and back forward, that controls a dot on a screen. And we're just going to make you reach towards that dot over and over again. We might put some sort of perturbation or some sort of like movement error, or something that you have to adapt to inside of that movement. And then, obviously over the first couple of courses of having that perturbation or having that change in the environment happen to where maybe you're reaching forward, but the dot goes to the left, you can then learn how to reach it through, your first sensory prediction, and then obviously updating it with each sensory consequence later and later and later. So through hundreds or thousands of these small adjustments, our motor program is formed and refined. And so that's where motor learning occurs. And this is a very simplified version of this. I'm not even diving into any of the areas in the brain that are important in this. I'm not diving into different ways to practice, different methods of motor learning, whether it be error-based, reinforcement, use-dependent, anything like that. I'm not diving into bimanual coordination or biomechanics at all. We're simply just saying that through you making a sensory prediction error over and over and over again, and refining your movement based on the feedback that you get, whether you are successful or non-successful, then you will create some sort of motor program through that motor learning process. And this is what we call internal feedback. And so, or intrinsic feedback, internal, intrinsic, kind of the same thing. You can think of it like intrinsic motivation that you bring from yourself. This is feedback that you get from yourself. There's nobody else that's talking to you, telling you like, hey, you tripped over that log, which there might be. If your asshole friend is on the hike with you, they might be there and they might tell you like, hey buddy, you tripped over the log, and you're, laying there on the ground like, yeah, dude, I know. But this is intrinsic feedback, meaning it comes from available information from the senses when we produce a movement. Another form of feedback is augmented feedback, which is provided from an external source, or extrinsic feedback in a way. And this is where we get to talk about knowledge of results and knowledge of performance, because they are two different things. And so, we've kind of gone through the motor learning side of things. We know what a motor program is. It's a kind of an idea in our head of how to do a movement, how to achieve a movement. We know what motor learning is. It's us creating that motor program so that we can do the movement more accurately in a faster fashion. And now we're going to learn about augmented feedback and this idea of extrinsic feedback and knowledge of performance and knowledge of results. So there's different feedback that we can receive extrinsically or from somebody else. And the best way that I can explain this again in the powerlifting and strength training world is the fact that you're going to send a video to your coach of your deadlift or your squat or your bench, and they're going to send you feedback. And that is extrinsic feedback. That is augmented feedback. That is feedback that is coming from an external source. And that feedback can be one of two things. It could be knowledge of results, or it could be knowledge of performance. And knowledge of results is super easy. This is the one that basically revolves around the end point of the movement. If you're thinking to yourself, did I or did I not squat the weight? You either did or you didn't. You either stood up with the weight or you failed and you had your spotters grab it, or it fell on the safeties or anything like that. That is knowledge of results. It is completely binary. You either did it or you didn't do it, which isn't used very often in powerlifting itself. Never in powerlifting have I seen a coach, or at least hopefully never in powerlifting has anybody had an experience with a coach where they are sitting there and they're just like, yeah, you failed. And that's it. That's the only feedback they get. Normally we can get that feedback intrinsically. We can know that from a sensory prediction error of us not lifting the weight. And so that's not very commonly used, but what we do use a lot is knowledge of performance. And knowledge of performance, unlike knowledge of results, which is about the end point of the movement, knowledge of performance is about the performance of the movement overall. So we can break down the movement into different things. We can break down, for example, the deadlift. We can break down the deadlift into how you set up, your hinge, your wedge, your slack pull, et cetera, varying order. But knowledge of performance is about the performance itself. It's receiving feedback about how you perform the movement, not just the end result. That is what knowledge of results is. So which one is more appropriate? I think, you guys kind of understand what I have already said, in the fact that knowledge of results is been able in laboratory tasks to allow individuals to learn a movement faster, provides them information about their movement error, normally in terms of like deviation from the movement. So absolute error in those reaching tasks like I was talking about earlier. But this doesn't always in much more complex movements like a squat or like a deadlift for novices. It doesn't always allow someone to have the required information to do the task correctly, especially when there are multiple degrees of freedom. And basically what I mean by degrees of freedom is, and if you're an exercise science or a kinesiology major or a coach or anything like that, you may already understand that. But if you don't, degrees of freedom are essentially just this way of thinking about multi-joint movements, especially in the motor behavior world. I believe degrees of freedom in the biomechanics world is how many joints are being used or how many joints a muscle controls. So like, for example, the rectus femoris, which attaches at the hip and also attaches at the knee. So it crosses the hip and the knee, helps in, hip flexion and knee extension. I believe in the biomechanics world, that means that it has 2 degrees of freedom. It's a biarticular muscle, 2 joints. In the motor learning world or motor control world, degrees of freedom means how many joints are being used in the movement. And so if I think about me reaching, so if you're watching the video, you can actually see me do this. If I think about me reaching towards this glass in front of me, I have, generally speaking, grossly, maybe about 3 degrees of freedom, we'll say, right? So we'll include my fingers as one joint. Obviously, there's 5. There's 5 metacarpal phalangeal joints, MCP joints, that make up the fingers, but we're just going to call that one joint. We've got our elbow, which, extends out to reach towards the glass. We've got our shoulder, which goes into a little bit of flexion to reach towards the glass. That would be something that has, 2 to 3 degrees of freedom based on how you look at it, whether you're just reaching out to it or whether you're reaching out to it and grabbing it. And so when we have movements that have more degrees of freedom, and when we have movements that are much more complex, knowledge of performance is going to be much more appropriate when we are, providing feedback. And, like I said earlier, knowledge of results is great in the lab. Like, it's great for me to use in the lab, and it's a great tool for people that are my subjects, or animals that are other labs subjects to use. But in the world of coaching, and especially in the world of coaching complex movements, um, you know, we're going to be using knowledge of performance. I think that's the best way that I can explain it. So this is where knowledge of performance comes in. It allows you to gain, feedback on the movement itself and the movement process itself, i.e., the trajectory of a reach or the pattern of force over time. And it basically means, if you can imagine only knowing the end result of a missed deadlift, like knowledge of results would give you, or bench, instead of the video that you'll watch or send to your coach showing you why you may have used that lift, you can see how knowledge of results wouldn't be too useful. So in general, knowledge of performance is important in closed loop situations. What I mean by that is, closed loop situation is a situation where your external environment does not change whatsoever. Environmental constraints do not change. If you've heard me talk about dynamical systems theory, which is another theory of motor learning and motor control, you've heard me talk about environmental constraints, task constraints, and personal constraints. Those three things create a movement behavior. So if you have a triangle connecting those three things, but environmental constraints at the top, personal constraints on one side, task constraints on the other side, those three things come together in the middle, poof, you're going to get a movement out of that. In a closed loop situation where you don't have the environment change, knowledge of performance is going to be much, much more useful. And that's what we have in the gym. That's what we have in the weight room. And so we're gonna have those environmental constraints of where, like, okay, we are going to the same gym every day. We're probably competing at the same place every time we compete. A lot of people do that. We like to have a sense of safety in a lot of things. It's this idea in powerlifting where we're controlling all of our variables. We like to compete on the same equipment, and so we like to make sure that, there's people that carry a bar around to different gyms just to have that happen. And so when we're in a closed loop situation, when that external environment is not going to change, we are going to be much, much better by using knowledge of performance. And so you can kind of see, as I'm laying this out, I'm kind of building a storyline of knowledge of performance being this king for us. However, in a lot of stuff, both can be very beneficial. Obviously, knowledge of results is something that's going to be binary, like I talked about earlier. But combining both knowledge of results, which is something that you get automatically, in my opinion, in powerlifting, as well as knowledge of performance, which is something that you get, from your coach or intrinsically by watching the video, you can see a huge amount of improvement in form or in technique. And there's a systematic review that I read, in preparing for this, called "When is Knowledge of Performance Superior to Knowledge of Results in Promoting Motor Skill Learning?" That kind of outlines that. And so most of the 29 studies that they did in this meta-analysis, which if you guys don't know what a meta-analysis is, it's essentially a way for a kind of a theory to be tested or something to be experimented on, by combining results from a bunch of different studies. And so it's kind of this super study where it's going to combine results from a bunch of different studies. So this one used 29 studies, and they examined in this systematic review or meta-analysis, that with there being multiple degree of freedoms and multiple dimensional movements, there is a high reliance on using both knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. However, a lot of them were kind of these laboratory based, studies or laboratory-based tests that may not have multiple degrees of freedom. And so, in that, I'll link it below, but in that, we don't really know if we can conflate, knowledge results being too powerful for complex movements, which again is kind of what I've talked about in the past. So, while, this systemic review has been able to, kind of tell us with laboratory tests that a combination of both knowledge of results and knowledge of performance is important. I don't think that, it's too great in telling us in the powerlifting space that we should absolutely use the two, because one of them is just going to happen automatically. We either stand up with the weight on squat or we don't. And so that knowledge of results is going to be something that's more binary. In general, though, when it comes to coaching, we tend to give a lot of extrinsic feedback, a lot of knowledge of performance feedback, especially to our beginners who are still trying to learn and ingrain those movement patterns, learn how to squat, bench, deadlift, etc. However, in our much, much more advanced athletes, people that are maybe going to nationals or who have competed multiple times, intrinsic knowledge of results or intrinsic knowledge of feedback or knowledge of performance kind of takes over a little bit. And their movement patterns are already learned in a way that they feel comfortable. It feels automatic. And they tend to use this kind of binary, did I do this or did I not do this right approach, which kind of aligns with the knowledge of results stuff. And I know I've been bouncing back and forth between these terms over and over again, but, just to kind of summarize it for you guys, in our beginners, knowledge of performance is widely used, even for themselves. They will look at their video, and if you've coached a highly aspirational beginner lifter, you've seen this where they kind of get into this paralysis by analysis mindset, which I'm going to talk about a ton later. And they'll kind of scrub through it and try and find every single thing that's wrong. Meanwhile, in a much more advanced lifter, they kind of already know how to squat. They know their movement patterns. That motor program has been trained and trained and trained. And through sensory consequences and through everything, they've been able to, create this movement pattern that is highly ingrained in their system, to where they can just do it automatically. And they tend to look at their performance much more in a binary way, much more in a way of, did I lift the weight or did I not lift the weight? And, kind of like I said earlier, that can be detrimental to their performance. That can be detrimental to their learning of a new skill or a new cue or kind of trying to create a more efficient movement pattern from something that may be already automatic. And, that's where us being coaches come in to give them some feedback using, intrinsic feedback and augmented feedback in this knowledge performance stuff. So like I was saying earlier, when they don't have this intrinsic feedback to guide them in the right direction, they start to explore solutions. All right, guys, we're back. Sorry about that. I had a little bit of a mishap at the camera. But I think where I laid off was the fact that intrinsic knowledge of results, for, individuals that can look at themselves in a third person perspective and kind of have that third person view, can be really nice. However, for a lot of people, it's going to be extremely hard for them to actually create a good outcome from it and use kind of this knowledge of results or knowledge of feedback to, help ingrain better movement patterns. And that's where coaches step in, obviously. And so in a lot of our more advanced athletes, this intrinsic knowledge of results takes over a lot, and it takes over for movement patterns that are already learned. So they can kind of use this binary, did I do this right or did I not do this right approach, which, like I said earlier, can be detrimental. And that's where guidance from extrinsic feedback or from a third party using knowledge of performance, you can start to explore for more solutions. But without that, you kind of lead into this paralysis by analysis that plagues a lot of eager intermediate and advanced athletes. And I've seen this happen so often. I've seen a lot of very ambitious and very strong young lifters who want to improve, which is absolutely fantastic, but then they look at their training and they try and nitpick it, and they try and change, or they try and, do everything correctly. And it actually becomes extremely detrimental to their success. And it's going to be so minute that it's probably not even worth it in the long run. And so I'm going to kind of take a break here and tell you guys about a kind of assumption that I made earlier in the podcast, but I'll address it now, now that I think about it. So earlier in the podcast, I had talked about this idea of complex versus simple movements and multiple degrees of freedom and all that kind of stuff. And for the average person, I'm going to make this assumption, for the average person, a bench, a squat, or a deadlift is going to be an extremely complex movement. It has multiple degrees of freedom. It has a ton of joints that are moving. There's all this technique that you have to think about. But for an intermediate or for a advanced lifter, it kind of becomes automatic. It becomes, in my eyes, what I would deem in the laboratory to be a simple task that has less degrees of freedom. And so I'm making that assumption. I will just go out there and say it. I will stick to my guns with it if anybody questions it. And that will be my answer. If they're like, but this is a complex movement, I'm going to say, well, relatively complex. But for the athlete that has experience, it is actually very simple. And, we can use the example of a tennis player. For somebody that's just starting tennis, an overhand serve, that's a very complex movement. For, a middle schooler or a high schooler, that's going to be a very complex movement. And knowledge of performance may be extremely useful there. But for, someone that is, playing at Wimbledon or a college player or just turning pro, when they do an overhand serve and they see that it went out of bounds, they're just going to use knowledge of results. They're going to use, some simple like, oh, nope, sorry, I didn't do it right, binary feedback to tell them, and update their motor program in the short term. And so with that assumption being said, and, with us being lifters, I think a lot of the people listening to this are going to be lifters, doing repetitions of this squat, bench, and deadlift tens of thousands of times, probably over years that you've competed. We can kind of think of these as being relatively simple tasks. So I make this assumption because when it comes to complex versus, simple skills, complex skills actually do take more knowledge of results or knowledge of performance to improve. And there kind of isn't this, point of it being detrimental in the research. However, I've seen it get to this point of being detrimental, like I talked about earlier with the paralysis by analysis, discussion, of it being detrimental. And, with us thinking of a squat, bench, or deadlift or any other action for an athlete being relatively simple, we can see why this knowledge of results or knowledge of performance can be something that plagues them and plagues their performance. So with that being said, relatively simple motor skills in a population studied, increased feedback via knowledge of performance or knowledge of results is actually detrimental to success. And I've kind of alluded to that earlier, but in a literature review titled Principles Derived from the Study of Simple Skills Do Not Generalize to Complex Skill Learning, it just echoes this. And it's actually really cool because this is work that's done by somebody that I am fascinated by, Dr. Gabrielle Wolf. She does a lot of stuff on intentional focus, which I'll talk about a little bit later. If you know me, I've talked about intentional focus so much. And also Dr. Charlie Shea, who was actually a faculty member at A&M he actually retired shortly before I started my program, which is kind of crazy. So when I was doing my literature review to, start creating the script for this episode, seeing those names pop up, I was like, hey, no, I'm definitely going to read this because those are two people that, one, I know Dr. Charlie Shea, and two, Dr. Gabrielle Wolf, I've read a ton of her work. And they basically describe 3 different reasons why frequent feedback or too much knowledge of results or too much knowledge of performance can be detrimental to these relatively simple skills that I talked about. And the first one is that learners can be too dependent on the information provided by the augmented feedback, so either intrinsic or extrinsic, and neglect the processing of intrinsic proprioceptive feedback that they normally rely on. So basically what this is saying is they mean that the feedback that is provided is so frequent that it makes them not remember how their body feels and in how they normally self-organize for a movement. And this is something that I talk about so much with a lot of my clients that, in my opinion, I use this phrase, think too hard when they're lifting. They literally think too hard. I tell a lot of my clients when they're in this, kind of process of paralysis by analysis that, you know, you need to turn your brain off. You need to think less. You need to just move. You need to allow your body to move, because in the general scheme of things, our bodies and our neuromuscular system is incredibly good at self-organizing our movement behavior. It is so good at putting our body in the best position to lift the weight. And when we try and think about a bunch of different things to fix that, and sometimes they're warranted, sometimes they're not, it can be very distracting. It doesn't allow us to use those proprioceptive mechanisms like muscle spindles or Golgi tendon organs. It doesn't allow us to use our, that kind of feedback to complete the movement. Those are things that we normally rely on. And so that's the first one, is the fact that they're too dependent on the information. They don't know how to move without the information, which then can be detrimental to actually building or changing the motor program itself. The second one is that frequent feedback makes movement more variable, as the performer cannot establish a consistent movement pattern. And this makes sense too, kind of with what I've talked about earlier. If you are going to think about a bunch of different things because you're sitting there watching your training back, over and over and over again, trying to figure out what you can do better, you're going to be trying a bunch of different things. And in the long run, that movement's going to be so variable that you're not going to be able to create or change that motor program that we talked about previously. And so, in line with the previous point, if you're consistently attempting to change something about your movement pattern via all of this extremely frequent feedback of you watching your training, you are very likely to have movement patterns that vary completely different from each other. And then the third thing that they talk about in this literature review is that frequent feedback provides too much facilitation in the planning of subsequent responses, which lessens the individual's need to perform memory retrieval operations that are critical for learning. They fail to develop their own error detection that can course correct in an online fashion. And I know that's a lot of words that might be a little bit confusing to people that aren't in the motor behavior or in the kinesiology world. But essentially what this is saying is all of this feedback creates too much for them to think about. Again, kind of in line with the other 2 points. And they don't allow themselves to kind of create that neural circuitry or kind of reinforce that neural circuitry that's very important for learning. And they fail to develop their own error detection, meaning they fail to, much like the last point, they fail to use that proprioceptive feedback possibly that can course correct online. And what I mean by online is something that they can course correct while doing the movement. Online means while they're doing the movement. Offline normally means afterward. And so when we think about online, performance gains, we think about that rate of learning the movement. We think about them actually doing the movement and whether it's, improving during the session. When we think about offline, normally we're talking about stuff like consolidation, retention, etc. And that's why I personally tell a lot of my clients who struggle with this just to send me a training video without watching it. Send it to me, delete it off your phone. Because as humans, we have this kind of innate ability and this innate mindset to want to try and find something to fix. And if you're consistently watching your training over and over and over again, you will eventually do this and likely change something that doesn't need to be changed. And then you won't be able to, kind of reinforce that neural circuitry to create a motor program or change a motor program. And, in the long run, back down sets are going to feel bad, et cetera, et cetera. And it'll just turn into a loop that never really ends. And so you'll likely try and change something that doesn't need to be changed on your back downs and subsequent working sets. It'll feel bad. And then you're going to get into this kind of just loop that sucks, which nobody likes to do. So those are kind of the 3 things that are the reasons why I think that in these relatively simple tasks, for lifters, knowledge of performance or too much knowledge of results is poor. But now we need to shift to the coaching side. And so why is this happening? Why, what kind of feedback should you be providing to kind of, help this? And I think that, I can kind of provide a good 3 points. I think I wrote three down. I did. I can provide a good 3 points to provide very, very good feedback. And I think this is something that's dependent on the athlete that you coach, obviously. But in general, these are things that I personally love to do. And the first one is I provide feedback that is simple as possible. With the human working memory only being able to provide or handle 5 to 7 items at a time. You might have seen that before if you did anything in psychology. And especially during a taxing movement, likely way less than that, more like maybe 2 to 3, at most 4 things to think about. If you are trying to change that many things, you are going to have an extremely frustrating training session. At least in my opinion, you're going to have an extremely frustrating training session that in the long run is going to make you hate the sport, which is not something that we want anybody to do. And so I try and make my feedback as simple as possible. I talk about fixing one thing at a time. Till that thing is fixed, then we're not moving on to the next step. I can give the example of one of my clients, Aaron Yu, with this. When Aaron came to me, he had a very inefficient bench press. One arm was lagging a lot. His wrists were pushing over the bar, which then, didn't allow him to keep center of mass over his elbow. And we worked on that. And he was wanting to kind of change everything at once. And when we do that, it's great if they can do it. It's very rare that a client can do that, but it's great if they can do it. But in the long run, it's going to take probably a lot longer for them to get through all of those things because they're trying to think of everything at once. And so we went through the process of, first, let's fix your hand position. Let's internally rotate a little bit more. Let's see how that feels. So we did that. It worked. Okay, cool. Let's move to the next step. Okay, so we first had him internally rotate more. So now, both arms are being, they're extending at the same time. Next step that we did was I think we taught him how to depress his scapula more so that he has a more consistent touch on his chest. Okay, cool. That's the next step. And then the last step that we did was simply add a little bit of pinky pressure so that bar is stable in his hands. If I were to tell him, okay, we're going to internally rotate, we're going to depress the scapula more, and we're going to, press our pinkies down on the bar, like, yeah, those are all great things. And immediately by watching his training early on, I could see that those are changes that needed to be made. But if I wanted to tell him all of those at once, it would have taken him much, much longer to get to the point where he is now, where he's, consistently hitting a PR every block. And so first thing that I do, I provide feedback that is as simple as possible. I provide, knowledge of performance that is as simple as possible. So after providing feedback that's super simple, one thing at a time, I then provide, I tell myself to provide feedback that's cueing them about their environment and not about themselves, which may sound very weird, when it comes to motor learning, because you want to think, normally you think like, oh, I want to move differently. I have to think about how I move. But this comes from this principle of focus of attention and this idea of focus of attention, which is what Dr. Gabrielle Wolf, one of the lead author on the previous literature review that we talked about, kind of based her career on. And I've read a ton of her work on this, and it's fascinating to me. And basically, this principle of attentional focus or focus of attention is an idea in motor control or motor learning, where an internally directed instruction about oneself can make what is normally an unconscious movement pattern extremely conscious, and then performance decreases. And so if I were to tell, somebody while they're bench pressing, like, I really need you to extend your elbows, that may be a little bit worse, or I guess the better example is if I can tell somebody in a deadlift, I really need you to extend your knees and lift the weight. That's going to be a much worse cue in my mind, or much worse feedback than telling them something like, oh, I need you to push the ground away from you. And it's simply because you are taking something that is normally something that's unconscious. They know that they need to they know that they need to lock their knees. They know that they need to extend their knees to lift the weight. But when they then think about it, it starts to make that unconscious movement conscious, which then kind of decreases performance in the long run. And so instead, I focus on cues or instructions that draws attention towards the environment instead of their body. And I'll link a couple of the papers that talk about this below. There's one that, shows that an external focus of attention allows for a higher vertical jump. There's also a huge review that actually one of the former students in our program was able to get on and help write. Tay, who and it goes through the entirety of what attentional focus is and how it's being used. But I tend to focus on cues that lead them to think about the environment and cueing against the environment, which is called external focus of attention. And these can be things, like I said earlier, like pushing the floor away from you, like a leg press on a deadlift, or pushing themselves behind or into a wall on a bench press for leg drive. We've heard that being said so much. However, if that isn't available, which it normally isn't, it's something that's kind of rare in our field, then instruction that draws their attention away from the midline of the body is actually also something that helps. And so if you have to use internal focus of attention, you want to use it internal focus of attention in a way that it draws them towards distal body parts. So telling someone to dangle their arms when pulling slack might be more beneficial than telling them to protract their scapula or kind of round their back in a way, because it makes them think about, okay, I'm allowing this bar to dangle in my hands, which is something that's so far away from the midline of the body, it's very distal, versus, thinking of their scapula, which is much, much closer to the midline of the body. And then the last thing is very obvious, but make it understandable. This is the last thing that I can maybe help you guys with. Make it understandable. Hopefully I was able to do this throughout this podcast, but this isn't something that I normally hit on. But when it comes to knowledge results, knowledge performance, as coaches, we are extremely knowledgeable. We are extremely, extremely smart about this space. I think that for a lot of coaches, I think with the educational content that has been coming out with Powerlifting Now, and guys with great informational posts, like the guys at TSP, Chris and Andy, Barbell Union with their entire team, as well as kind of the OGs in the space, like Steve DeNovi, part of Powerlifting Now, and Sean Noriega and Matt and all those guys, and Marcel, so I'll say his name too. We know a lot about programming. We know a lot about technique, and we can talk about it for days. But if you cannot make your feedback understandable for the client, and this is where it kind of gets a little bit more niche and it's going to be different for each client, it means nothing. And so if you cannot provide knowledge of results or knowledge of performance in a way that's going to be understandable, you are basically just speaking a different language to the client, and they're not going to be able to understand any of those concepts. And so one lifter with a background in personal training and maybe a degree in kinesiology might know what it means when I tell them, hey, I need you to internally rotate at the shoulder, while you're setting up for hook grip, so that you can grab that index finger, or you can grab that thumb with your index and middle finger a little bit easier. However, another lifter might just need you to tell them, like, hey, I need you to point your fingers towards yourself a little bit. That's going to naturally just put you in internal rotation. If you just have yourself point the fingers towards each other, and I'm doing it on camera right now, if you just naturally point your index fingers towards each other, you are going to create internal rotation. And so being able to adapt your feedback and being able to provide feedback that is relevant for each lifter is the most important thing. And it's kind of what encapsulates all of this that we've talked about. And so more than the amount that you give them, more than the focus that it yields, whether it be internal or external, if they cannot understand it, it literally does not matter. And so that's where I'm actually going to end us off here. Hopefully you've enjoyed going through this path of what knowledge of performance, what knowledge of results is. We've talked about a ton here. We've defined motor learning. We have, shown you that in a relatively simple task, too much knowledge of performance or too much feedback can be extremely detrimental and put you in this place of paralysis by analysis. And, we've given you reasons of why, whether it be that they're too dependent on information, whether it be that, it creates the movement or more movement variability, or whether it be that it doesn't allow them to develop the neural circuitry that, creates a better or new motor program, as well as, hopefully I've provided you with some outlines of how performance should be, or how knowledge of performance and knowledge of results should be provided to your clients. And so if you've gotten this far, I really do appreciate it. This is a little bit longer of a solo episode, but it was one that I was really excited to write up, and it was one that I'm really excited to bring to all of you guys, because this is my field, and whenever I can bring stuff from my lab, or stuff that I'm reading from my lab to powerlifting or to strength sports, I love it. It's a gap that I think needs to be bridged, and if I can be a part of that, then I love that. And so, if you've gotten this far, I really appreciate it. I think that, I'm not sure really how it works, but I think you can rate it on Spotify, rate it on Apple Music, like the video, comment on YouTube. This will be on YouTube as well. And if you've got any questions for me at all, feel free to shoot me a DM on Instagram, comment on the YouTube, whatever it be. I'd love to talk about this with anybody that is interested in it. And if you're interested in picking up some 110%, you can do that below. If you're interested in working with me, you can fill out the coaching application below. But other than that, guys, I love talking about this. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And as always, continue climbing.